And I was smart enough to know that we shall overcome did not mean probably in this lifetime. So I was dug in. I knew this was going to be a long battle. Joan Baez was once America's most beautiful voice. Now, at 83, her life has taken a heartbreaking turn. After struggling with mental illness for decades, she finally admitted the horrible truth. She was sexually abused by her famous father. The folk legend who dated Bob Dylan and Steve Jobs now lives alone, sleeps in a treehouse, and talks to plants instead of people. She even named one tree the counselor because it listens better than her therapists ever did. It's a shocking end for the woman who once sang at Martin Luther King's side. Joan Baez's story begins long before she ever sang a note. Her father, Albert Baez, was a brilliant physicist who helped invent the X-ray microscope while still a student at Stanford. But what made him stand out wasn't just his mind, it was his conscience. During the Cold War, he turned down well-paying jobs in the defense industry because he refused to work on weapons. Instead, he took on quieter, less profitable work at universities, and with UNESCO, his daughter would later say, "We would never have all the fine and useless things little girls want when they are growing up. Instead, we would have a father with a clear conscience." That sense of integrity would become Joan's inheritance. When Joan was a young girl, her family moved often. One of the most eye-opening stops was Baghdad, where her father was helping set up science programs at the university. At just 10 years old, Joan was thrown into a world of harsh contrasts. She remembered landing in the heat and chaos and seeing a beggar beaten by police right at the airport gate. In the months that followed, she saw people digging through garbage, children crawling in the streets, and animals treated cruelly. She read the diary of Anne Frank during that time and caught one illness after another. Years later, she said, "Our little souls saw the same things and took different things out of it. I carried the weight of it." That year stayed with her. It opened her eyes and her heart. Back in California, Joan began to notice other forms of injustice. Although she was born in New York, her Mexican heritage made her feel like an outsider. At school, some kids called her a stupid Mexican, but she didn't quite belong with the Mexican students either. She didn't speak Spanish. She felt caught in the middle, but it sharpened her sense of right and wrong. "I was brown and wasn't accepted," she said, "but I knew the real issue was for the blacks." That understanding would shape her choices later, like when she refused to perform for segregated white audiences in the South, choosing instead to sing at black colleges, even though it meant risking her career. Around this time, another powerful influence entered her life, the Quaker faith. When Joan was 8, her family became Quakers, a community known for their deep commitment to peace and justice. Their values quickly became her own. She remembered hearing talk around the dinner table about war, peace, and moral choices. At age 15, she listened to a speech by Martin Luther King Jr. that moved her to tears. Not long after, she refused to participate in a Cold War air raid drill at school. That act of quiet rebellion landed her in the local paper and marked the start of her activism. In the summer of 1959, something magical happened at the very first Newport Folk Festival. An 18-year-old girl named Joan Baez, with no record deal and no fame, stepped onto the stage barefoot with her borrowed guitar. She sang 2 songs with folk singer Bob Gibson. Just 2, but those few minutes changed everything. Her voice, high and pure, like nothing the crowd had ever heard, left everyone in stunned silence. Suddenly, this unknown teenager was the name on everyone's lips. Big names like Pete Seeger and Bo Diddley had performed that night, but it was Joan people couldn't stop talking about. Record labels rushed to sign her, and though she'd go on to sing at Newport for decades, even into her ADC, it was that single serendipitous night in 1959 that launched her legend. Just a year later, at 19, Joan recorded her first album in an unlikely place, a rundown ballroom in New York's Manhattan Towers Hotel. It wasn't glamorous. She sat on a dirty rug with just 2 microphones, recording while trying not to be interrupted by bingo games held there on Wednesdays. There was no fancy production, just her voice and her guitar, but that raw, honest sound became something special. Though it didn't chart right away, the album eventually climbed to number 15 and stayed on the charts for nearly 3 years. Instead of signing with a big label like Columbia, Joan chose a smaller one, Vanguard Records, because they promised her artistic freedom. Years later, the Library of Congress would call that album one of the most important recordings in American history. Before the festivals and records, Joan had been quietly building her confidence at a little club called Club 47 in Cambridge, near Harvard. When she first performed there, the room was almost empty, and she was terrified, but there was something about her that people couldn't forget. She seemed mysterious, almost otherworldly. Within weeks, the crowds grew. Soon, lines were forming down the street. She went from making 10 a night to 25 solo, which was a lot for a coffeehouse singer in 1959. That small stage became her testing ground, where she shaped her voice and her presence in front of an audience that couldn't look away. The image that followed her from those early days, the barefoot Madonna, began at Newport, where she sang without shoes. It became more than just a quirky detail. Her bare feet came to represent her purity, her rebellion against the polished, fake side of the music world. People treated her like a saint, even though she didn't want to be. She once wrote, "I am not a saint. I am a noise." As the years passed, that pressure to be perfect weighed on her. But in her 80s, Joan found a kind of peace. She danced barefoot in Paris, not for the crowd, but just for herself, free at last to be exactly who she wanted to be. Everything changed again in 1961 when Joan walked into a club in Greenwich Village and saw a scruffy young guy named Bob Dylan perform. She was already a star. He wasn't, but when she heard him sing Song to Woody, she was shaken. His voice was raw, but his words were powerful. She later said it made her fall apart inside. It was that beautiful. A deeper connection formed a little later at a party when Dylan sang With God on Our Side. That song changed how Joan saw him. She realized he wasn't just talented. He was something else entirely. Over the next couple of years, Joan used her fame to help Dylan rise. In 1963, she invited him to sing with her at the Newport Folk Festival in front of 10,000 people. The crowd didn't love him right away, but she believed in him. She brought him along on tour, gave him stage time, and introduced his songs to huge audiences. At one concert in Queens, she spent more than half her set singing Dylan's songs. She told her fans, "Bobby Dylan says what a lot of people my age feel but cannot say." When the two of them performed at the March on Washington on the same day Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech, it was clear Dylan wasn't just a songwriter anymore. He was a voice of the movement, and Joan had helped him get there. But fame changed things. By 1965, Dylan had outgrown their partnership. He asked her to come with him on a UK tour. But once there, he left her off the stage. Joan walked around backstage, confused and heartbroken. She couldn't understand why he wouldn't invite her to sing. And then, without warning, Dylan married someone else, a woman named Sarah, who was pregnant with his child. Years later, Joan admitted, "Dylan broke my heart. I was just stoned on that talent." For him, the decision was simple. Sarah would do what he wanted. Joan wouldn't. He didn't want a partner. He wanted control. Despite all of that pain, in 1968, Joan recorded a whole album of Dylan's songs. It was called Any Day Now. She picked the tracks by spreading his sheet music on the floor, closing her eyes, and choosing at random. 16 songs made the cut, including some Dylan had never even recorded himself. The result was stunning. Critics praised her voice, especially her haunting version of Tears of Rage. She even drew the artwork for the album herself. It wasn't just a record. It was her way of working through everything they'd shared and everything they'd lost. In the summer of 1963, Joan Baez was just 22 years old when she stood in front of a massive crowd at the March on Washington. She sang We Shall Overcome just before Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. Joan had known the sting of racism growing up. Her father was Mexican, her mother was Scottish, and their family faced discrimination. That pain became the fuel for her lifelong fight for justice. Only 4 years earlier, she had gotten her big break at the Newport Folk Festival. Now, her voice was echoing across the National Mall, singing an anthem that would become forever tied to her name. The March on Washington brought together about 250,000 people, most of them Black Americans. It helped push forward the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Joan's voice became part of that turning point, not just a singer, but a symbol of how music could move people and change the world. 2 years later, in March 1965, Joan joined another historic protest, the Selma to Montgomery marches. These came after Bloody Sunday, when peaceful marchers were brutally attacked by police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Joan walked with thousands over the 54-mile journey to Montgomery. Photos from the time show her standing among the marchers, talking, listening, being part of the moment. The night before the final rally at the Alabama State Capitol, she sang at a concert called Stars for Freedom, alongside artists like Nina Simone, Tony Bennett, and Harry Belafonte. It wasn't just a performance. It was a call to action, and it worked. Later that year, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. She also refused to play at venues that enforced segregation. In the early 1960s, many Southern colleges still didn't allow Black students, and Joan refused to sing at places that upheld those policies. Instead, she chose to perform at historically Black colleges and universities. This was a bold choice, risky for her career, and even dangerous. During one performance at Miles College in Alabama, she arrived just as the notorious police chief Bull Connor was ordering mass arrests in nearby Birmingham. Joan stayed at one of the only motels in the area that allowed both Black and white guests. Joining Martin Luther King Jr. and his team, she didn't just talk about justice, she lived it. In 1964, Joan Baez made a bold move. She refused to pay 60% of her income taxes. She said that money was going to fund the Vietnam War. This act got national attention. It was one of the first big moments of tax resistance during the war. Others followed her lead, and a movement began. Although this didn't send her to jail, her protests grew stronger. In 1967, she was arrested twice for blocking the entrance to a military center in Oakland, California. Her mother was with her. They both went to jail for more than a month. Many people saw this as a powerful act of peaceful resistance. By the early 1970 SE, thousands were refusing to pay taxes that supported the war. Some even refused to pay their phone bills, knowing that tax funded the military. Then, in December 1972, Joan did something few dared to do. She went straight into the war zone. She traveled to North Vietnam with a group of peace activists. Their goal was to bring Christmas letters to American prisoners and raise concerns about human rights. But while they were there, the U.S. began a massive bombing campaign over Hanoi. For 11 days, Joan stayed in a hotel bunker while bombs dropped above. She recorded everything: explosions, children playing in ruins, a Christmas Eve service that had to pause because of bombing. She later said it was the first time she truly faced the idea of her own death. That experience stayed with her for the rest of her life. Even before that trip, Joan was building something bigger. In 1965, she used money from her music career to start the Institute for the Study of Nonviolence. She started it with her mentor, Ira Sandpearl, in Carmel Valley, California. But not everyone welcomed them. Locals feared the institute would attract hippies and stir trouble. They tried to stop it through legal means, but Joan didn't give up. She quietly reopened the school in December. The institute taught ideas from people like Gandhi and Thoreau. Students learned how to speak, write, and organize peaceful protests. It stayed in Carmel Valley for 4 years, then moved to Palo Alto, and later became the Resource Center for Nonviolence in Santa Cruz. Through all this, Joan made strong connections in the activist world. One of them was Jane Fonda. At first, they admired each other deeply. They met in 1967 in Rome while Jane was filming a movie. Joan suddenly appeared in Jane's kitchen, held her hands, and told her they were beautiful. It was a magical moment. But years later, their views started to clash. Both had been to Vietnam, but they came away with different opinions about the Vietnamese government. The split became public in 1979. Joan helped publish a full-page ad in major newspapers. It criticized the Vietnamese government for human rights abuses. She asked them to stop the torture and open their prisons to outsiders. Jane disagreed. She defended the Vietnamese government and sent around a letter criticizing Joan's actions. Their falling out shocked many in the peace movement. It showed that even among allies, deep differences could exist. In 1991, when Joan Baez was 50 years old, she wrote a powerful letter to her parents. For years, she had kept something painful locked away. In the letter, she accused her father, Albert Baez, a respected physicist known for co-inventing the X-ray microscope, of sexually abusing her when she was a child. This wasn't something she remembered on her own. It started when her sister Mimi called and said, "I think something terrible happened in our childhood. Do you want to look into it the way I will in therapy?" Albert denied everything. He said the memories weren't real, that they had been planted by therapists. He called it false memory syndrome. But Joan, while unsure about the exact details, believed something had happened. In a later documentary, she explained, "You are never completely sure, but even if 20% was real, it was enough to wreak the havoc it did." Despite the pain, she eventually forgave her father before he died in 2007. Near the end of his life, she sang to him while he sat in his wheelchair. It was a quiet, emotional moment between them. From the outside, Joan always seemed calm and graceful, especially on stage. But inside, she struggled deeply. She later revealed that she had lived with mental illness since childhood. She was diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, a condition where her mind split into different personalities. One of them was called Diamond Joan. Others took on voices and stories that weren't hers, like a 12-year-old German boy whose parents had survived the Holocaust. These parts of her showed up in her poems and songs, along with DID. She also battled anxiety, depression, panic attacks, and terrible insomnia. It got so bad that even in happy moments, she would quickly crash. It felt like an eternal sentence, she said. Her mental state even affected her bond with her son, Gabriel. She admitted, "I wasn't there for him. A lot of times I was there, but I wasn't there." In the late 1970s and early 1980s, things got worse. After the Vietnam War ended, Joan felt lost. The causes that once gave her purpose had faded. She said, "I have to figure out what I'm doing on Earth." During this time, she became dependent on pills, Quaaludes, and anti-anxiety medication for 8 years. They numbed her feelings, but didn't fix anything. When asked how she finally quit, she joked, "Well, actually, the person responsible for me quitting was President Carter. He banned those wonderful pills, and I couldn't get them anywhere anymore. So I gave them up." It was a dark joke, but it told the truth. Outside forces, not inner strength, ended her addiction? Her journey with therapy had started early, back in 1957 when she was just 16. A psychologist told her parents she had numerous emotional problems and a deep sense of not being good enough. That first visit began a lifelong relationship with therapy. Over the years, she saved hundreds of cassette tapes from therapy sessions, records of her trying to make sense of her life. Still, for decades, she avoided going too deep. It was too scary to deal with, she said. But in her 50s, she finally allowed herself to dive into the hard stuff. Hypnosis sessions helped her dig up long-buried memories. It wasn't easy. Therapy, she said, was like digging through emotional wreckage. But in the end, it brought her to a place of light, a kind of peace she had never known before. After her stormy relationship with Bob Dylan ended, Joan Baez took a bold step in a new direction. In January 1970, she released One Day at a Time, an album that surprised many. It was recorded in a country music studio in Tennessee, Bradley's Barn, and marked her deep dive into country music. This wasn't totally out of the blue. Her husband at the time, David Harris, loved country music. He was also a strong voice against the Vietnam War and was in prison for refusing to fight. While he was locked up, Baez recorded the album, which followed the style of David's album, another country-inspired record she'd made for him the year before. But this shift wasn't just personal, it was political. Folk music was seen as left-wing and rebellious, while country was often tied to conservative values. By stepping into country, Baez was crossing a line most artists avoided. The album mixed songs from all over the musical map. The Rolling Stones, Willie Nelson, protest classics like Pete Seeger's Carry It On, and even the labor anthem, Joe Hill. For the first time, Baez also shared her own songs. She wrote Sweet Sir Galahad for her sister Mimi and a song for David for her husband E, showing a new side of herself as a songwriter. A few years earlier, Baez had taken another creative risk, this time with classical music. Between 1966 and 1968, she teamed up with composer Peter Schickel, who was also known for his funny alter ego, P. D. Q. Bach. Together, they made 3 very different albums. The first, Noel, was a Christmas album filled with traditional songs arranged with full orchestras. Next came Joan, which reimagined songs by the Beatles, Paul Simon, Tim Hardin, and Donovan using classical instruments. Then came Baptism, a journey through our time, a strange and powerful mix of spoken word and song. Baez performed poems by writers like James Joyce and Walt Whitman, backed by sweeping orchestral music. This wasn't the kind of music folk fans were used to, especially in the late 60s, when most artists were going electric and psychedelic. But Baez chose a quieter, more thoughtful path, showing she wasn't afraid to stand apart from the crowd. In 1974, she made yet another bold move, this time into another language. She released Gracias a la Vida, an album sung almost entirely in Spanish. The timing was important. Just months earlier, Chilean folk singer Victor Jara had been killed by the new military government. Baez wanted to honor him and others like him. Though Spanish wasn't her first language, she sang with heart and skill. Even performing one song in Catalan, listeners in Latin America were deeply moved by the album. In the U.S., the language made it less popular, but critics praised Baez for her sincerity and beautiful delivery. One of the standout tracks was Jara's haunting song Te Recuerdo Amanda. She also included a duet with Joni Mitchell called Dita, where their voices played off each other in a dreamlike way. Her version of Guantanamera wasn't a pop cover. It was a tribute to its Cuban roots, full of meaning and respect. Then came the song that would define her career. It all started with a surprise phone call from Dylan in 1974. He read her the lyrics to his new song Lily, Rosemary, and the Jack of Hearts from a payphone. The call brought back a flood of memories. Baez sat down and wrote Diamonds and Rust, capturing both the beauty and the heartbreak of their time together. The lyrics were raw and poetic. She remembered Dylan as the unwashed phenomenon, the original vagabond with eyes bluer than robin's eggs. The song struck a chord with fans. When Dylan later asked to perform it during the Rolling Thunder review tour, Baez joked it was about her ex-husband. Dylan didn't buy it. Years later, he admitted to be included in something that Joan had written. Who? I mean, to this day, it still impresses me. In 1982, Joan Baez was 41 when she met Steve Jobs, who was just 27 at the time. They were introduced by Baez's sister, Mimi, who ran a charity and needed computers for prisons. Jobs was immediately drawn to Baez's sharp mind and sense of humor. Their friendship quickly turned into a serious relationship that lasted for 3 years. Jobs even thought about marrying her, but he held back. According to a close friend, Jobs wanted a family, and he knew that wouldn't happen with Baez, who already had a teenage son. One strange moment that stuck with people happened at a Ralph Lauren store. Jobs pointed out a red dress he thought Baez should have, but when she said she couldn't afford it, he didn't buy it for her. That left a mark. Even after they broke up in 1985, they stayed close. Years later, Baez thanked Jobs in her memoir for pushing her to start using a word processor. He left one in her kitchen. That wasn't the only surprising relationship in Baez's life. Back in the early 1960 SE, when she was just 22, she had a romantic relationship with a woman named Kim, or Kimmy. It lasted 2 years. At the time, being open about that kind of relationship was nearly unheard of. But Baez spoke about it openly in a 1972 interview, and again decades later in her 2023 documentary, I Am a Noise. Kim was wild, carefree, and didn't care what others thought. Baez remembered the two of them walking around town in boots, suspenders, and messy hair. They were, as she said, just ruffians. The relationship gave Baez a new view of love, one she found calming after years of being with men. She said that leaving this story out of her memoir would have felt like leaving out a huge part of her life. In more recent years, Baez found an unusual source of peace: trees. Since around 2010, she's been talking to them. One, across from her house, is so important to her that she named it the counselor. When she's troubled or has big questions, she goes to that tree for answers. She got the idea after reading a spiritual book she once thought was silly, but it ended up changing her mind. She even built a tree house 20 feet high in an oak tree behind her house. In the summer, she climbs up and sleeps there. She says it's magical. Birds fly so close, she can feel the wind from their wings. She once fell while climbing down, hurt herself, and had to go to the hospital, but she still chooses the tree over a therapist. As she puts it, "The tree is my therapist.